In this fantastic and engaging contemporary era, when anyone can publish content on various platforms, where freedom of speech, thoughts, and ideas are no longer censored and gate-kept as before. When ordinary people around the world have the opportunity to collaborate across borders, to try to figure out what is happening around us, and what has happened in history before. When young, engaged, and courageous people dare to challenge the thoroughly corrupt establishment in various countries. A form of grassroots movement that is incredibly inspiring, developing, and democratic. When news about important events now quickly appears on unfiltered and uncensored platforms, and immediately reveals exactly how the usual news reporting we were previously fed with clearly shows how traditional mainstream media angles and filters information that does not fit their activist agenda. Then there is finally hope for the world to become more objectively enlightened and, for once in a long time, form one's own opinion based on facts, and actually what gives citizen voting democracies a real opportunity to make well-informed choices based on factual and impartial information. When one can openly share thoughts, share ways to scrutinize material, share previous methods and experiences that have been used to deceive populations around the world, it is amazing to see how this movement is growing among engaged, courageous, and driven honorable people. The present, curious, and socially engaged who refuse to sit as uncritical brainwashed puppets in the face of the propaganda we have been fed for decades. In times now when historical information is emerging about how the world has been governed for so long, it is incredibly important for people and populations in the world to learn how deceived people in different countries have been by their own elected officials, the responsible authorities, and the propaganda in the media. And when the mass awakening begins to spread and take shape about what has happened in the world for several decades, and how the evil old world order has ruled through blackmail and involvement of secret deep states, there are many points and opportunities to also highlight a specific very important event in its entirety, which can better explain how, and in what way, the hammering propaganda from the establishment in various Western countries has functioned. How a cover-up of a horrific event, like a prime minister's murder, works, and that together with the knowledge, experiences, and tools, we can solve more of the major strange events that have occurred. That is why a film with more realistic and knowledge-based descriptions of what happened on Svevigen in Stockholm, on a cold February evening in 1986 is still so relevant and important, so that Sweden and even the world can heal and look forward to a more peaceful, open, and honorable world for the sake of our future generations. Something that even the current American administration has given the appearance of wanting to strive for. When the awakening about the now transparent methods, the dark forces, that have long been used to scare, silence, threaten, oppress, and cancel, no longer have any effect. When it no longer works to label critical voices as racist, homophobe, misogynist, conspiracy theorist, Islamophobe, anti-Semite, or anti-establishment extremist. When this method no longer takes hold, the world is on the way to waking up from an oppressed slumber. When one can finally think and express oneself freely about previously labeled conspiracy theories, like an actual population replacement, and it might be pedophiles and thoroughly corrupt parasites who rule the world, then it is no longer just the American capital swamp that the world needs to drain, but also all other thoroughly corrupt deep slave states around the world in other countries, especially those that have been part of, involved in, and aware of the whole thing for decades. And now when it becomes so clear that different countries' elitist governments are fighting so hard to restrict freedom of speech and force ordinary honorable people into submission, and scare with punishments against everything that is to be incorporated into the concept of hate, just to give the appearance that people can no longer be criticized, it is a very dangerous path we are on. How nowadays people are arrested just for expressing an opinion with strong sympathies for their own people and their own culture. It is so revealing in how all this is deliberate and intentional. Wrapped in socialist, communist, dictatorial corrupting activism. And it is really here that both knowledge, real evidence, and methods are pure tools to help each other move forward in that work. Therefore, one of these in the series of unsolved political murders that happened 40 years ago is a fantastically good start, in allowing one of the long-labeled conspiracy theories to transform into a common reasonable theory, and an explanation of what actually happened. In one of the world's largest unsolved murder investigations, as it is said, which would take 9 years just to go through the material in the investigation, we will show that there was a much simpler way. By digging into real circumstances, witnesses' concrete statements, and whistleblowers' fantastic information, we will be able to give a complete picture of what reasonably happened at the murder and the subsequent cover-up. And it is when, with the right knowledge, methods, and commitment, one can go all the way and inspire others to contribute to engaging in spreading, so that the truths come to light. Especially for future generations who deserve an honest, more genuine, and better world than the one we others grew up in. It is this unsolved Swedish Prime Minister murder that this film will be about, and also to place it in and contextualize it right up to today's context in world politics. The murder, often called the Swedish John F. Kennedy murder, so that people around the world understand what an open wound this murder in open street still is for large parts of the Swedish population. A 40-year-old unsolved Prime Minister murder that deserves a real revelation, and not all the fake solutions that the Swedish establishment has tried to sell to its own deceived population for 4 decades. Now, when truths about how previous regime changes and leader changes have been carried out in the world, it becomes all the more relevant to also bring the Palme murder into this context, and finally bring forward what happened on Sveavägen almost 40 years ago, when Sweden's democratically elected Prime Minister was completely cold-bloodedly executed on a central street in Sweden's capital, in front of the eyes of his own wife and a large number of shocked, innocent witnesses. For real truth seekers, the evidence of how the entire murder was covered up will be incredibly valuable in interpreting both the present and history. And as most will understand, this film is part of a real cry for help from the Swedish deceived population, and the hope is that the world's truth seekers can also help free us Swedes from the establishment's complete grip on the psychological abuse that honorable people have been subjected to. Ordinary people who just want to participate and live in a world they understand. With all the many parallels that exist between this murder investigation and other major political assassinations, there are many concrete, unpleasant connections between several of the events. If you are already interested in the murder of John F. Kennedy, you are probably right to engage in this case as well. It is now that we have the chance to help each other and bring forward all the previous heroes, who as whistleblowers, took all the shit for what they engaged in. It is now that we together can give redress to all those who were previously affected and who were diminished, ridiculed, and threatened. It is now the chance for the good and those who hope for a better world to engage in a real paradigm shift, when the sick old world crossed all boundaries in the hunt to maintain its world order. There are also so many inspiring people right now to draw facts and evidence from, like Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Scott Horton, Ola Tunander, etc. The following film has its origin and describes a multi-year private investigative project, based on witness psychological knowledge and methods as a foundation. That we with witness psychological knowledge have figured out what actually happened, who has been involved, but above all how it happened, when Swedish politicians, authorities, and media have acted to lure in, threaten, silence, diminish witnesses, and deceive the Swedish population for almost 40 years. In the fake investigation and cover-up that has been conducted ever since the shots fell on Sveavägen a cold February evening about 40 years ago. It all started in the fall of 2021, when it became obvious how a state-supported and tax-funded cover-up just continued year after year and continued to point out completely innocent people for the murder of the Prime Minister in the same transparent pattern they have always done. Even obviously over-dramatized in an accusatory series on Netflix. Evidence, conclusions, and revelations are based on available material that is accessible on the internet, in archives, and in media. Everyone can form their own opinion about the truthfulness of evidence and conclusions, but to understand the methods and how a state-controlled propaganda cover-up of a prime minister murder and how one of the world's largest murder fake investigations has proceeded, has advantages for all people to understand and partake in for the future. Surely there are people who will react negatively to the information and evidence that will be brought forward and would rather live in a simple and predictable naive world, where politicians, authorities, and media are judged to stand for the stable and secure in society and in the world. And for these people, this film is probably nothing you will enjoy, want to understand, or take in. You might do best to stop watching right here. Otherwise, it is possible that your awakening could become too world-shaking. To nevertheless try to bring back everyone's thoughts to the time when the murder took place in 1986, we need to highlight a lot of events that place the murder in its real context. Olof Palme was a person who was right in the center of events during the strained and conflict-filled Cold War 80s. A Cold War where it was about being on one of the great powers' sides. Being neutral could very well be even worse for one of the superpowers because you didn't know if you were an enemy or not. In this double game, the very intelligent and eloquent Olof Palme seemed to thrive. For many years during the 80s, there was also a bloody war between Iran and Iraq, which many countries earned big money from supplying weapons to. Olof Palme had previously mediated in the conflict and was well versed in what was going on and had contacts with representatives from both countries. A dirty exploitation of this conflict, which in recent years has shown that the USA exported weapons to both sides of the conflict, which also describes how extremely cynical the entire warmongering weapons lobby in the USA has been for several decades. It is also important to understand that the USA's administration during the early 80s was governed by people who resorted to all dirty means to win elections, which has been revealed in the so-called October Surprise, which meant that George Bush Sr. secretly negotiated with Iran not to release the hostages before the 1980 election, as it would likely lead to Jimmy Carter being re-elected as president, due to public sympathies. Instead, they negotiated large sums of money and weapons to delay this hostage release so Reagan and Bush would win the election. We will return to the book that describes more about this event later. From a Swedish perspective, Olof Palme was right in the middle of this conflict in the Middle East and aware of the various turns. In this, Palme also represented Swedish interests with a long history of arms manufacturing and therefore wanted to help with arms sales and try to save Swedish jobs. Especially since Sweden did not want to pay for its own rearmament itself, but saw an opportunity to finance it by exporting to other countries. The problem was just that officially, there were high moral rules about not selling weapons to warring nations and conflicts, which made these sales dirty but at the same time very economically profitable, especially for desperate countries in bloody wars. The relationship with the West and the USA had long been a hidden alliance, and many within NATO already saw Sweden as the 17th member. The USA had already since the 50s with William Colby at the helm built up the top-secret Swedish stay-behind network. A group of violence-potential right-oriented people who, in the event that the Soviet Union would occupy Swedish territory, would act like guerrilla warfare in small secret cells. An idea that the West came up with in connection with the end of World War II, when there were no people who could act behind the enemy's lines. Several examples of how the USA supported Sweden economically a lot were that Volvo had been sold in the USA for many years, and much of Swedish export went there. Even when it came to arms manufacturing, the development was joint, and advanced weapons with completely decisive components came from the USA. For example, the Euro and the battery used in Robot 70 came from there, and the engines for Swedish fighter jets were American. So integrated and completely decisive for a strong and economically prosperous Sweden were thus the Swedish contacts with the USA. Despite Sweden outwardly pretending to be neutral. To further understand how hypocritical and deceptive, both to the Swedish population and the world, Swedish arms export was during the 80s, and how revealing it is when these dirty stories are unraveled, it is so clear when private involved, and the Bofors company become the only ones affected and hung out, while the responsible politicians and authority persons go completely free. At the same time as it corrupts the state administration itself in the cover-up, it becomes a power demonstration in authority abuse, and unfortunately in extension exposes the country to both security risks and external blackmail attempts by aware regimes. Information from a documentary from 2013 describes the context very clearly. Bofors Affairs during the 80s is a collective name for several different dirty arms deals. It was the company Bofors that was involved in events that even Prime Minister Olof Palme acted as a salesman for. But several of the destinations were questionable, and the approach with intermediaries and bribes was highly dubious. Already in May 1984, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society filed a police report against Bofors for arms smuggling. Bofors had in 1979 and 1980 smuggled 300 copies of the anti-aircraft missile Robot 70 via Singapore to Dubai and Bahrain in the Middle East. According to the arms export law, you may not export war material to countries that are at war, have a risk of going to war, or to a country that violates human rights. To circumvent this, Robot 70 was sold to a company in Singapore, called Unicorn International, which then resold Robot 70 to Dubai and Bahrain. On May 28, 1985, Ingvar Bratt came forward as the man who revealed the affair. But as many Swedes already know, it was only people at Bofors who were affected, as politicians and authorities distanced themselves and blamed everything on the company. On December 22, 1989, Bofors directors Martin Ardbo, Leonard Paulson, and Hans Eklund were sentenced to conditional sentence for goods smuggling by Stockholm District Court. The three had to pay the costs for their defense lawyers, Ardbo 920,000 Swedish kronor, the others over 500,000 each. Nobel Industries was sentenced to pay 11 million Swedish kronor in fines for exporting weapons illegally. During the 1980s, India wanted to buy heavy artillery. Olof Palme had personally brought up the matter in talks with then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. From the Swedish state's side, credit support and guarantee support had also been provided, i.e., that the order would be fulfilled even if India ended up in an armed conflict. The Indian government had at an early stage, already in 1980, made it clear that it did not want to see any intermediaries in arms deals. Both in 1983 and 1985, India returned and expressed its dissatisfaction that Bofors used intermediaries. In the last negotiation round, there were two suppliers, Bofors and a French manufacturer. The order was worth 8.4 billion Swedish kronor. On March 14, 1986, the Indian government decided that the order for 410 Haubits 77B would go to Bofors. Due to Olof Palme's funeral, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was in Stockholm on March 15 and delivered the official message. On March 16, 1987, Sweden's radio's Echo editorial staff revealed that Bofors had bribed its way to the order. Through bank accounts in Switzerland, Bofors had been able to bribe appropriate decision-makers in India. Bofors denied that the payments to a company in Switzerland had any connection to the India deal. On April 29, Minister of Foreign Trade Anita Graydon gave the National Audit Office, RRV, the task to investigate what payments Bofors had made abroad. The National Audit Office's report showed that Bofors had paid out at least 260 million Swedish kronor to a company in Switzerland. The main stakeholder in this company was an Indian, W.N. Chadha, who had been an agent for Bofors for many years. To RRV, Bofors stated that it had liquidated its intermediaries in India in 1985. On August 19, 1987, Chief Prosecutor Lars Ringberg decided to initiate a preliminary investigation for bribery. This investigation was closed in January 1988. In India, the bribery scandal received a lot of attention and is considered to have contributed to Rajiv Gandhi and the Congress Party losing the parliamentary election in November 1989. Bofors director Martin Ardbo was called to the trial in India in 1999 but refused to appear. Olof Palme was, however, fearless in world politics for several years, didn't care much about what would be written on his tombstone, as he himself highlighted in an English interview, and played a very dangerous double game in world politics when he tried to have good relations with many of the world's leaders, and especially the populations that were oppressed in different countries, in the vile events that were going on around the world. He was one of the only ones who dared to criticize the superpowers' actions to win the people's sympathies and also took a stand for the communist ANC in South Africa and against the apartheid-ruled regime. A regime that Palme had long opposed by shipping large sums to the resistance movements and urging the whole world to boycott economically. But it was at the same time as the Swedish security service had close cooperation with Western security services. Something that, according to information, was thawed and deepened in 1982, at the same time as Olof Palme won the election in Sweden again. A time followed by major mass media conflicts about submarine hunts between Olof Palme and the Swedish defense. In recent years, however, information has emerged that it was probably the Western powers that drove much of the underwater activities in Swedish waters, and also a propaganda war so that Sweden would not approach the Soviet Union, and the current leader who was open to discussions about free trade agreements and weapon-free zones around the Baltic Sea. A Soviet leader that Olof Palme had plans to visit in April, just over a month after the murder. It is thus in this politically very dramatic, war-torn, and dirty money lucrative context that Palme was shot on the open street a cold February evening in 1986. In this now completely unsolved and obviously covered-up Swedish Prime Minister murder with a strange fake investigation that has been marked by so many strange revealing events, it is not possible to move forward without trying to get answers. Then one must ask the question, how could this happen, and how do we find out what really took place? With the mass awakening that is currently underway in the world, where we now understand how propaganda institutions have influenced us to set aside all our critical senses and label all those with deviant opinions as conspiratorial or sick, there is now a fantastic movement in the mass awakening that is underway. With all the knowledge we now have and that is available in the world, now when gatekeeping media no longer has full control over what we should think and feel. How people are starting to wake up and understand that the exaggerated unhealthy trust that populations, and Swedes in particular, have had for the political establishment in different countries is starting to crack and be revealed. What has even led to an ongoing population replacement and mass immigration in Western countries, this also becomes pieces of the puzzle, in that context and the whole. When people understand that we are really on the verge of being completely censored, deplatformed, and character assassinated, for speaking concretely and factually about important events. When people finally start to understand and see patterns in major events that yet another lone man would have carried out, despite the circumstances never adding up, many more understand that it reasonably cannot be true. It is now that this movement is growing in the world, and the question is only who wants to stand on the right side of the paradigm shift. Who has the drive to challenge the dumbing propaganda narrative? As a summary, there are thus very many current events during the Cold War era that could have led to the execution on Svevigen. There could also have been different motives for why Palme was seen as a risk that could not be controlled, in an eventful and dangerous time, where it was about knowing which side you were on. But as we will see in this film, it is what really happened at the murder scene, and the details and the concrete threats that have been formulated directly to the main character, and those who have tried to dig into the circumstances, that give the decisive puzzle pieces to arrive at this whole. For a long time, many interested people in Sweden have understood that this 40-year-old unsolved case is something other than an act by a lone man. A several decades-long fake investigation has been carried out, where so much has been blamed on the police's early mistakes, and it has been overemphasized so many years of post-constructed official truths that have so many contradictions in themselves, and that do not match real concrete evidence from and around the investigation. There are also clear patterns around this Prime Minister murder that have many parallels to several international high-profile events where it has also been blamed on a lone man, and in the Swedish case, it has meant several designations of Swedish lone men over the years, like Walter Kirisits, Victor Gunnarsson, Christer Pettersson, Stig Engström, and most recently Christer Andersson. Despite several of these people not even having the opportunity, or even reasonable motives to carry out such an act. And from a Swedish contextual perspective temporally in 1986, it would require a very exceptional Swedish person to carry out such an act against a Swedish democratically elected government representative, with the risk of getting more than half the population against you and your loved ones. That is why the lone man has never been a reasonable alternative. The problem is that no one before has been able to explain the hole behind the cover-up when they have pointed it out. The case has also been marked by all the strange formulations that have come from high-ranking representatives and involved prominent profiles in Sweden when they have actually spoken about the murder, in a way that undoubtedly suggests that the case could not be solved in a normal way, but that it was about a cover-up, and that they therefore know exactly what happened to be able to state that. We have, for example, immediately in the investigation, the self-appointed investigation leader and almighty driver in the fake investigation and cover-up, who has expressed himself very revealingly over the years. And for people to understand that there are often underlying motives and explanations to look for in these quotes, we will here list a whole lot that has marked the investigation over the years and revealingly been the subject of speculations of all kinds. With this film, we will give reasonable answers to all that most can accept the evaluation of, which only confirms the scope and the whole of what has been going on for almost 40 years. So one of the foremost to throw out strange but interesting statements in different contexts was the first investigation leader Hans Holmer, who controlled the covering fake investigation with an iron fist. Holmer has among other things said that, "When the truth about this comes out, the Swedish society will change fundamentally." Also that, "It was Olof Palme himself who chose to be shot at Dikarima." And, "It is the victim who has chosen the murder scene." Holmer has also said that, "As soon as we can tell something, we do. I have a lot to tell, but cannot." Further, "Now I'm playing a high game, because sooner or later you'll get the answer." And, "It was a state guerrilla that killed Olof Palme." And, "The truth about Palme's death is now classified until far into the 2000s. Holmer has then in his own book written about the murder of Olof Palme as that he was shot in ambush on the open street. Even Anders Ferm, UN ambassador and close friend to Palme, has said that the Swedish people are not yet mature enough to hear the truth about the murder. And when a friend of Anders asked about the information that there were plans for an assassination attempt against Palme, Anders clearly said, "Leave that alone. Leave it. You shouldn't touch that." We also have a former minister to Palme and ambassador in Paris, Carl Lidbom, who has hinted that it might be best for Sweden if the murder remains unsolved. Or, it would be best if the murder of Olof Palme never gets solved. Olof Palme's close friend Harry Schein has also stated that there are state-bearing forces that do not want the murder of Olof Palme to be solved. We also have revealing information from the former director of Bofors, Martin Ardbo, who really rings in how aware he was of what happened. If Olof Palme's involvement in the Bofors affair becomes known, Sweden's government will probably fall. The same Ardbo has also said that Palme himself was deeply involved in Bofors arms deals, and now everyone is afraid that I will tell the whole truth. But the truth about the cannon deals with India and what belongs to it, I take with me to the grave. The truth dies with me. Even the succeeding Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson called shortly after the murder to opposition leader Ulf Adelsohn and said, "Now that this has happened, it would have been better if it had been a single man. But it seems to be very well planned a long time in advance. It is a sign that there is a group that does not shy away from anything to damage Swedish society." We also have the very strange veiled threat that was expressed by media cover-up profile Leif GW Persson in Crime of the Week, as late as 2018, when he warned an engaged and enthusiastic new prosecutor for an unthinkable alternative that he didn't even want to think about and that will have horrific consequences. But it has not only involved people from the establishment who have given strange, but at the same time clarifying clues to what has actually happened. We also have the Säpo-employed witness, a cleaner, Ylva G., who happened to overhear when a Säpo chief shouted, "He was not shot as Prime Minister, he was shot as a private person," an event that she then regretted having heard. A very central witness named Anna Hage, who years after the event was approached by a person in military uniform. A person who threatened and motivated that the witness should be silent, with, "We must ensure that it is calm in the country." And we also have an American journalist, New York Times journalist, Richard Reeves, who about a year after the murder visited Sweden to find out more about it, who during almost a month conversed with Swedish representatives, even off the record. One person stated that his career could be ruined if it became known that he even talked to Richard, and who stated, "We thought we could interfere anywhere in the world, without taking sides. Palme decided to take a higher profile, and now we are paying the price." Others stated that the truth about the murder? Most of the people in the government don't want it. It would be disastrous for the foreign ministry if people knew how stupid we have been in the Persian Gulf. Another person Richard talked to in the office at Rosenbad said, "We know at this point that there is less than a 10% chance to solve the murder. That is not our problem. Our problem is what the people of Sweden believe happened and how they deal with that." It was about preserving Sweden's critical international relations and trade, and that the government should have the people's trust. Politically, solving yesterday's murder might not be worth the trouble it would cause today. Further said, "All we want now is for this to be over with, one way or another. We must get it behind us." One can calmly conclude that the truth about what really happened was well known among leading people in the Swedish government, and that the truth would never come to light. That the price for Sweden as a country economically, international contacts, and trade was more important than solving the murder. It becomes through this very obvious that a lone madman was the best solution that the entire Swedish establishment tried to drive. In a remarkable parallel with the murder of John F. Kennedy. Even if over the years it has been discussed and speculated about the quotes and information, there is no doubt that influential people in Olof Palme's vicinity, and in the covering political establishment, have full control over what actually happened and mean that the murder only needs to be solved, not be able to be cleared up. It is also in all quotes that one often finds the revealing deviations that do not line up with the official narrative, and that therefore are the best entrances in an investigation of this kind. Also as a confirmation that one is probably on the right track. Do the strange quotes correspond to what actually happened, or does one need to dig further to get even more reasonable explanations? This pattern also becomes clear in the concrete information we will come to, such as that just hours after the murder, deliberate and covering activities began to pin the first lone man, who in Sweden has been called the Mad Austrian, Walter Kurisitz. A person that the covering investigation leader Holmer only meant got away with the skin of his teeth because he happened to have a police alibi at the time of the murder. He was namely at a completely different place in conflict with police, and could therefore never have been involved in the murder of the Prime Minister. The remarkable thing is thus that just that was the reason he got away from the accusations. It was not because he could not have anything to do with the murder at all. So if we now understand that just hours after the murder, they actually deliberately and intentionally tried to pin someone completely different, the very important question comes about why. And why did one need to protect and cover up the event itself? What was the motive, and in what context was it more important to hide the truth than to actually solve the Prime Minister murder, explain the truth to the Swedish population who still has a deep, open wound, after the shocking event? That is what we will explain in this film. Once the insight that the Palme murder has been a direct cover-up of the murder, just minutes after the shots on Sveavägen fell, and then been a fake investigation that has been going on for almost 40 years, then comes the question of how to find out what actually happened, and which people one can draw credible information and decisive details from. It is also what will later ring in who were involved in events on the murder evening, and what probably happened. Fortunately, when one understands that it is about a cover-up and a fake investigation, one can first focus on the information from all the whistleblowers who have marked the investigation over the years. Those who have brought forward concrete information without for that matter needing to buy their own conclusions about what happened and who were involved. Which is a very important distinction in the investigative work that is the basis for this film. Drawing important, relevant, and factual information from different informants does not necessarily mean that one assumes that everything these people contributed with, or their sometimes unreasonable assumptions and conclusions they come with, is true. Here there is an enormous flora of honorable people who have refused to go along with authorities, politicians, and media's manipulations, threats, diminutions, and character assassinations. People who dedicated the rest of their lives to fighting and challenging the Swedish establishment windmill. Among others, a police commissioner, Gösta Söderström, who was the first on the scene and who had to deal with the events around the murder scene. A commissioner who for the rest of his life claimed that the alarm for the event went out about 6 minutes after the official information and about 9 minutes after the shots were fired, and that he had time to get information about the event when he was stopped by a private person on an adjacent street in the city who several minutes before had fled from the scene and from the murderer. The person who many years after his death came to be the subject of an accusation as Prime Minister murderer in connection with the investigation being closed in 2020. We have the fantastic journalist Sven Einar who dug up that Hans Holmer, who led the cover-up initially, never was in Borlänge during the murder night as he lied about when he stepped into the investigation the day after the murder and took over the helm in the fake investigation. We also have Holmer's chauffeur who in an interview stated that he drove past the murder scene, just 7 minutes after the shots, with Holmer in the car. Just here there are incredibly many early contradictions that show that information from different people cannot be combined, and from an investigative perspective, it is precisely here that the answers are when one understands how to dig further in investigative work. Einar is also the person who has brought forward information that a person who looked for a liquor store near the murder scene, days before the murder told that he met just County Police Chief Holmer and Sapo Chief PG Nass, who were seen reconnoitering at Tunnelgaten. This information is of course completely decisive to understand that there was already a planned activity for the murder evening, even if it absolutely did not need to be about the murder itself. But that it is here that one can draw far-reaching conclusions that both Sapo and Holmer, as responsible for police in Stockholm, have planned for an activity on the murder evening that is covered by the then top-secret NATO organization Stay Behind, which is also confirmed by information on the murder evening about walkie-talkie observations at the murder scene itself, already earlier in the evening, that give clear evidence that it was a planned upcoming activity just at that place before the couple even walked past. We also have fantastic information from a TV producer, Lars Krantz, who ended up in a strange situation on a bus on the way home during the murder night and involved just one of the police who then became identified as one of those who was involved in the exercise on the murder evening. Something that Krantz drove so far in his conviction that he was fined for defamation when the covering establishment went after the accusation from Krantz. But Krantz also dug up the important information from friends of the Palme couple's son Martin, that he already a week before the murder stated that he could not join a celebration of a friend, because he had already planned to go to the cinema just on the murder evening, and see exactly the film that the Palme couple, son Martin, and his girlfriend actually went and saw a week later. This information also overturns the official narrative that the cinema visit was not planned at all until the last minute, precisely in line with them having mistaken the time for the film's start time and therefore happened to be there a quarter before it started, which obviously only was about that being the time that applied to pick up already pre-booked tickets before they were released for regular sale. This too became a post-constructed truth from the covering Palme fake investigation that has been hammered in to the population for almost 40 years. Yet another important information in connection with the murder itself has come from journalist Peter Ekstrand, who was out working in the city this evening with a number of polices. According to his information, they happened to pass the murder scene shortly after the murder, and when the police he traveled with stepped out and asked what had happened, they only got information that there had been a knife fight at the scene. So nothing about it being Sweden's prime minister who had been shot and that they needed help to search for the murderer. Ekstrand became so shocked when he later that night got information from some girls about what had happened and who had been affected. It further confirms that the cover-up around the murder began very shortly after the shots and was thus limited to a very small group who had been involved in the events on the murder evening. We also have a police, Eva Karlowitz Borg, who worked at the crime duty during the murder night, and she and her colleagues were thus not allowed to tell anyone that Olof Palme had been shot. Eva, who over 30 years after the event still does not understand why. Many circumstances around the investigation were also noticed by honorable people who strangely enough did not get to be involved in the actual work. We have the prosecutor K.G. Svensson, who became involved as preliminary investigation leader in the case but was completely opposed by investigation leader Holmer, who would lead the fake investigation and cover up with an iron fist. K.G. Svensson became completely convinced that the bullets found days after the murder, in strange places, where previous technicians had already searched, could never have lain there, and suspected that they had been placed there afterward, by the fake investigation. K.G. Svensson even tried to get investigations of the facades to see if it really matched the bullets found place, which revealingly Holmer completely opposed. Holmer refused to cooperate with the prosecutor, and finally complained so much to the government that K.G. Svensson had to leave the case. But it was anyway then K.G. Svensson on his own initiative who wanted the two guys who could give one of the deliberately and intentionally accused person, Gunnarsson, alibi for the time of the murder and therefore completely write him off from the case. Something that Holmer and other police had refused to do, despite the information about the guys having come forward in interrogations with Gunnarsson. That the bullets really were placed there and had nothing to do with the murder was also admitted by the chief of the technical section himself, Vincent Lang, in connection with him retiring. An information he strangely backed away from when he obviously was taken by the ear. As everyone understands, there have been people, in and around the investigation, who have provided information and described how they have been treated by the innermost circle, which makes that already here there are many honorable people to draw important information and details from. But above all, this explains the deliberate cover-up that has marked the investigation already after the shots fell on Svevigen. But there are also many innocent witnesses and others drawn in, who have been affected over the years, whom we must also focus on. There are many affected people in this tragic event and subsequent cover-up. Especially all the witnesses who have been crucial in putting the puzzle around the murder together. Several of them and their statements have been diminished, idiot declared, discredited, and even threatened by the Palme fake investigation. Statements exist from several witnesses on the murder evening about walkie-talkie observations around the Palme couple and the places they were at. All have been waved away with post-constructed explanations that it would have been other uninteresting police operations on the murder evening, and the explanations have been delivered in a steady stream over the years to diminish the witnesses' truly interesting and relevant observations. A proper lady was even called bag lady, to really diminish the person's statements. But above all, there are several independent witnesses who have provided important and revealing statements to the investigation that have been manipulated in connection with them being written down. There are statements that have been replaced by completely new written pages in already conducted interrogations. Text has been added by other police officers, despite them pretending to be the original. In other cases, information has been added and other erased. Witnesses have been moved geographically between interrogations. There are few audio recordings available with witnesses, and there are many summarized interrogations rewritten by police afterward. A policeman very involved in important statements from Lisbeth Palme on the murder night was completely erased from the material in connection with the prosecution against Christer Pettersson. That there are hardly any ways to get material from the investigation without it being arbitrarily masked also speaks for the establishment not wanting revealing information to be released to the public, even though the investigation has been closed for several years. There are also concrete statements on how uninterested receiving police have been in statements, and when the persons later requested their own interrogations, they on many points did not at all match the statements they had given. And when they have submitted the original statements they initially made, they prove invaluable to understand that even police involved in the stay-behind exercise on the murder evening were completely unexpectedly shocked that the shots fell and that the secret exercise had to be abruptly interrupted in connection with it. But we also have concrete and threatening statements that have been conveyed to a high-ranking parliamentarian who was even a possible future Minister of Justice, in the parliamentarian Jerry Martinger, who refused to stop digging into the statements around where Holmer really was during the murder night. Jerry, who was offered an opportunity to advance in his career if he just promised to stop digging into the Palme murder. This ultimatum was backed by a Swedish prime minister. When Jerry refused, many turned against him and he was later accused and prosecuted for things he never committed, which more or less destroyed his political career. It was also in connection with these honorable heroes who refused to be intimidated by the Swedish deep state's clear threatening messages that it was revealed how far they were willing to go to silence the truth. They could frighteningly account for exactly what Jerry and others had been doing in everyday life and how they could cause accidents in their vicinity, but also at the same time very revealing in the serious threats explained that it was a one-time occurrence, and if the truth came out, the population's trust in Sweden as a rule of law state would disappear for a very long time. It is really in these motivations and the scare threats that we get the explanation for the scope of the cover-up. But even from inside the covering authority organization, one can dig up concrete information that tells precise details about who were involved and what happened at the murder itself. We have a special criminal inspector, Jerker Soderblom, who even during the investigation's course is promoted to commissioner because he so detailedly refuses to do dirty work and investigate red herrings and thereby shows that he knows exactly what happened and how he actually has the opportunity to reveal the entire cover-up when he rings in exactly which area in the world, with Bulgaria in the north, Morocco in the west, Iran in the east and no delimitation in the south, which clearly points out South Africa as the last stop for the area it is about. With this geographical description, the small island of Crete ends up right in the focus for who has been involved in the events on Sveavägen on the murder evening. But we will get to that. Even a covering investigation in collusion with Swedish MS media and how they choose to angle the information can sometimes reveal fantastic statements. When it turns out that several of the strangely acting police on the murder evening, with right politically oriented opinions, are highlighted in media to mislead and shift focus from the truth and the real course of events. The police who had previously been taken under the wings of Holmer several years earlier and who in Stockholm went under the name Baseball League, for their hard and brutal methods to keep control of nightlife in Stockholm. Then it turns out later that rumors exist that the police have been on trainings and exercises in South Africa from 1982 and onward. The rumor says it should be about 10 to 15. But when the police themselves investigate this and compile a report, they revealingly only come to that it has been a few who visited South Africa in other private contexts. A transparently obvious way to diminish and wave away these rumors that instead only confirm that Sweden at this time trained Swedish right-oriented police to be guerrilla-trained in South Africa within the stay-behind organization in the event that the Soviet Union would attack Sweden. As you surely already understand now, there is incredibly interesting, relevant, and important information to take part in, from and around the investigation. Both in the form of revealing quotes from establishment representatives, incredibly important and central witnesses from the murder evening, but also the obviously covering actions that both the fake investigation and the entire Swedish establishment have brainwashed the population with for 40 years. So what is it this time that makes a difference in what information has come forward, in the overall description? So what is the difference in this investigation, around what happened and all other previous attempts in digging that have come forward over the years? The big difference is the basic knowledge in legal and witness psychology that has been used in the investigative work and applied to the material. The great genuine interest in criminal investigations in general, interest in human behavior and actions, and the underlying motives that exist for how we actually act in a certain context. And as with many genuine interests, engagement often comes automatically when one's knowledge can be applied in a very practical and effective way, and after about a year's research in available material, it became clear what had actually happened at the murder site and who were involved in the events. What randomly started with trying to give an innocently accused a post-death redress for what the thoroughly rotten establishment tried to do. Again. Then that it just went on to unravel the rest around underlying motives and who actually benefited, or perhaps did not lose, so much from Palme being executed and disappearing from world politics and conflicts. So with the right knowledge and methods to go through and evaluate witnesses' statements in different forms, it was not so difficult to map out what the most central witnesses had experienced and seen. With methods like statement validity analysis, SVA, which is such a tool that starts from the information in statements from witnesses and suspects, but also to some extent how the interrogations are conducted and designed. SVA is the most researched verbal truthfulness tool so far, and more than 50 studies have been published to investigate how this tool works. It is also the one often used in daily life, as SVA assessments are used as evidence in criminal courts in several European countries. Also, tools and methods like content-based criteria analysis, CBCA, and reality monitoring, RM, were used to find completely decisive details that gave clues about who were involved, which unreasonable conflicts existed in contradictory statements from the same person, but also between persons. It is precisely in the borderland in the statements that revealing details have led further in the investigation. Much work around collecting statements has of course already been done by many other people in books and other documents that have come out. But it was about basic knowledge of how to proceed to analyze, evaluate, and investigate the content in the statements to be able to put the puzzle pieces in a comprehensive whole. With a great genuine interest in the research that has been done and with role models like Astrid Holgersen, Elizabeth Loftus, Per Anders Granhag, Aldert Fry, and many others, it was almost shockingly easy to dig up the circumstances and the revealing contradictions that developed the work. And where many others have let go of contradictions and relevant revealing deviant statements far too easily, it was precisely there that most substance was. Several of revealing contradictions that have been found and how they so progressing have led further in the investigative work we will get to. Even if covering forces from the establishment in MS media have done everything in their propaganda power to diminish the testimonies from people who happen to be in the center of events on the murder evening, which in itself is very revealing, it is the most central witnesses who have provided statements that have been necessary to sort out what reasonably happened on the murder evening around the Palme couple. And it is what is so fantastic that with the right knowledge, it was possible in just over a year's work to sort out what happened at the murder site, and then bring all this to a whole in what has been behind the entire murder and the cover-up. Therefore, we will highlight specific witnesses and what statements it may be about, that have been decisive to understand what happened. Especially since it is very rarely that these relevant statements are discussed in the usual Palme murder contexts because they are so revealing for what actually happened. First, we have the important witness taxi driver Delsborn, who at least in his first interrogation tells that he is sitting at the red light on Svevigen and looks to the left and sees a couple talking with a man outside Dikarima. And what is so decisive from a witness psychological perspective is that Delsborn can describe in detail how the persons stand in relation to each other, and that he experiences that they are talking. The statements are thus anchored in descriptions that cannot be waved away and must thus be evaluated credible in a consistently reasonable course of events shortly before the shots are fired. It is namely when Delsborn gets green light and starts driving that the shots fall at the intersection. Then the absence of the same description of conversation between the man and the Palme couple in statements from Lisbeth Palme herself. So there is already here an obvious covering explanation that Lisbeth withholds for covering reasons. It should also be added that Delsborn in statements to the first police on site states that the person he saw talking with the Palme couple had a blue padded jacket. Second, we also have the fantastic witness Bjorkman, who had been at a party with work colleagues who is inside an ATM withdrawing money, while Bjorkman is looking for other following friends, who he thinks will come walking on Svevigen North. Bjorkman, however, gets tired of waiting and starts walking south on Svevigen, and then perceives also the company with 3 persons at the advertising pillar, and who he thinks seem to have fun. He then perceives the company walking in front of him, and that one of the 3 a few meters ahead puts the hand on the shoulder, and then fires shots at the man who collapses. Bjorkman was shocked and hid in an entrance to the Dikarima store. In the first account to the police that Bjorkman gives, he tells about the person he saw together with the Palme couple as being as tall as him, and with a blue padded jacket. But the important thing is that Bjorkman in a later interrogation has realized that it may have been another person and that the one who fired the shots may have been standing waiting around the corner of the building. And it is precisely here that this course of events gets its very reasonable and anchored explanation when we turn to the last witness at the murder site, who actually saw parts of the course of events before anything has happened. It is the completely decisive witness Marelius, who is sitting in his car on the other side of the intersection and waiting for comrades to withdraw money from an ATM. Marelius is namely sitting in the car and sees what happens outside Die Karima on front row, and sees how the waiting perpetrator stands outside the Die Karima bevel for several minutes and waits for the Palme couple. Marelius has explained that he thought the man behaved so strangely and understood that something was going on. When he then sees the Palme couple come walking past the strange man, he steps out and cold-bloodedly executes the Prime Minister with 2 shots in quick succession. Marelius has stated that it was a cold slaughter by a cold killer who knew exactly what he was doing. He then disappeared calmly and smoothly from the scene. Even these statements that the professional killer fired both shots at Palme and none at the wife Lisbeth also speak against all the official truths we have heard over the years. Add to that statements from the witness Fawzi, who met the couple before the meeting on Svevigen, about a following person in blue padded jacket, who he then after the shot sees disappear into a nook in the building on Svevigen, so one understands that the man that Fawzi thought was too old to be bodyguard really is a person that the Palme couple knew and who they pleasantly talked with at the advertising pillar, before the waiting perpetrator took over a few meters later, at the intersection. So it is really this person in the blue padded jacket that the entire Palme fake investigation has tried to erase and memory hole over the years. The person who has been part of a theory, the so-called meeting scenario, which has long had an anchoring in many of the concrete testimonies from the murder site, but revealingly never has been confirmed by the widow Lisbeth. This person many have been hunting for over the years, and we can now finally explain exactly who it is. It is namely the person who solves the entire explanation to how the execution of the Prime Minister probably happened and who is behind the murder. It can namely only be a small group in the world who can plan and execute what happens, of what actually plays out on the murder evening and at the murder site. And what establishes and completely clarifies who the person is that followed the Palme couple up to a brief encounter of around 40 seconds at the advertising pillar is namely the remarkable witness Wennerling, the artist, who saw a man as early as 9 o'clock outside the Grand Cinema, staring through the window to check if Palme was at the cinema. This careless person, who of course does not behave like a future perpetrator, was sketched by witness Wennerling days after the murder and sent to the Palme fake investigation. These sketches of a man in a blue quilted jacket, with unique facial features and details, leave nothing open to misinterpretation once you understand that the person the Palme couple briefly met outside Die Karima, on their way home from the cinema, was none other than Olof Palme's friend, Theophilos Souranakis, whom we will henceforth call Theo, mayor of the village of Machos, in Crete. What also strengthens this is that the closest witness, witness Bjorkman, heard Lisbeth say something in a foreign language in connection with the shootings. And since Bjorkman already works at a high-tech company, it is easy to assume that it could not have been English. Therefore, it is reasonable that it is about Greek. Add to that embarrassing revealing information about a Greek man, who is taken in for questioning at the police station, and is put on the entrance report, even though he has not even seen anything of the murder, and you understand that this is fabricated information, which the fake investigation created to cover up for the abducted man, who after all was interrogated at the police station, later that night. It is thus once again this very Theo, Palme's friend Theo from Crete, who unlocks this entire investigation and actually explains both later statements from Homer, that the victim himself decided the murder scene, the Prime Minister was shot in an ambush, and that Palme should have been shot as a private person and not the Prime Minister, as a senior manager at Sapo was heard screaming apologetically of the Sapo employee's witness. When we then come to who the perpetrator would have been in his dark coat and without a head covering, as several witnesses have stated, there is also confirming information from witness Hage that he had a fit body and moved like a panther. Witness Hage has also, in recent years, described how the Palme couple and a person were standing facing each other before the shots, which contradicts Lisbeth's account of what happened at the crime scene. What is decisive? That at a point by the advertising pillar, there was a brief meeting between the Palme couple and the friend Theo from Crete, but that it was a deliberate condition for the waiting professional killer to stand completely calmly at the Dicarema corner, waiting for the couple to finish the meeting and then come walking by, so he could carry out the well-planned execution. What also provides evidence that it was indeed Olof who wanted to pass Dicarema for the meeting with Theo, has been revealed by a nurse at Sabbatsberg Hospital, who heard Lisbeth recount that. The official explanation that it was Lisbeth who wanted to cross the street, to look into a clothing store, is thus just yet another explaining post-construction, as part of the cover-up. And when it comes to who the perpetrator would have been, it is once again just to take help from the same Sapo-employed witness who heard a Sapo chief excusingly shout that Palme died as a private person, who also saw the African professional killer Anthony White in Sapo's premises days after the murder. This important witness has thus provided two completely decisive statements, and in the description of how she did so much for several prominent persons to take hold of it, it unfortunately ended as usual with the witness more or less being threatened to stop bringing forward these statements. Which has also been a revealing pattern around witnesses and the investigation in a parallel with the witness Katrin, outside the Grand Cinema, who saw a man act threateningly against Olof Palme, and when the witness thought to intervene, Lisbeth gave a dismissive look, as if everything was in order. When the witness tried to bring forward these statements, she was first offered a plea to think of the widow, before the threats became tougher and more personal against her via her employer. Even Hage's companion, the witness Karen Johansson, has provided relevant and important information about how strange and revealing Lisbeth's behavior was in connection with the incident. How she tried to push away a life-saving Hage, and then ran out into the street waving her arms, as if she knew that there were many other people nearby who could provide Palme with better help than Hage could. Karen Johansson is also the important witness who definitely states that it took between 7 to 10 minutes before the police and ambulance arrived at the scene, and at that time Karen was occupied with nothing other than trying to calm Lisbeth in her strange behavior. To end important statements about what happened right after the shots and where the perpetrator went, we have the hero witness Jepsen, who at least thought he followed the perpetrator and dared up on the ridge, where he revealed strange police behaviors right after the shots, where he in a detailed account explains how he walked around and looked for a perpetrator for a good 6 minutes of the time, that the Palme fake investigation then tried to magic away, of the time it took to clean away the stay-behind exercise and then go on the alarm as if they had been completely unaware of what had happened. And it is all these statements that become so embarrassingly revealing inconsistent in how it temporally never is possible to get times and contradictory statements from involved, with a real consistent course of events. We finally also have the witness Engström, who becomes part of the course of events when he happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and in his fleeing and confusion with the perpetrator, lies about when he came back to the murder site and what he was doing there. He understood early that he could be mistaken as involved, and therefore chose to lie his way through what he had been doing. For the covering Palme fake investigation, this suited very well to mislead everyone into believing that the perpetrator ran up the stairs to the ridge, and therefore the Palme fake investigation sought to cover up for Engström's all lies, but then had to adapt all the time to his new statements and utterances. Not so strange that Holmer called Engström the elephant in the china shop. This is a concrete and important list of central witnesses and what they contributed with decisive relevant statements, to be able to investigate the course of events. But in the very important witness psychological investigation, there are some details that need a more in-depth account, and that are completely clarifying that it was a direct cover-up of the murder already during the murder night. It is so important for all truth seekers to learn how one should look for the mistakes made in this investigation, to possibly reveal other covering events around the world. In this part, we will delve into the most important breakthroughs in the investigative work, and what will forever be among the revelations that mean everyone will probably understand that there is no other alternative to what actually reasonably happened. It is simply then we put all witness psychological knowledge into practice, apply it to the material, and move forward in the investigation. And when most people understand the heavy anchoring in these statements, there is no reasonable developmental and mental way back to an ignorant and naive worldview again. When one understands in what way we have been deceived all these years, no one will be able to not understand it anymore. The absolutely most important evidence, both for how early the cover-up of the Palme murder itself was, and evidence that the real perpetrators of the act would never be caught for the murder, came just hours after the event on Swedish. It is about a very strange event already during the murder night when the Palme couple's son Martin, with a strange impulse, in the middle of the night, comes up with contacting the police, because he suddenly came up with a man who behaved following in connection with the son and his girlfriend separating from the couple on Swedish, shortly before the murder took place. When everyone who previously looked at this remarkable interrogation from 5:20 in the morning on March 1st, in the details that stand, have only tried to interpret as factual details of the future following murderer, a person with witness psychological knowledge has a completely different approach and a different analytical ability. It turns out that son Martin's descriptions of how it actually happened in connection with how this interrogation would have been conducted during the murder night never can be consistently matched to a unified coherent description of what actually happened. As an example, Martin claims that he contacted police guarding outside the residence to get a ride to the police station, and once there, met the interrogation leader Borge Wingren, who according to the interrogation would have shown a picture to Martin of the mad Austrian, which Martin then would convincingly have pointed out as the person he saw in the evening. The big revelation and completely decisive basic problem with the entire fabricated description is that, in the interrogation itself, the interrogation leader himself describes that they were contacted via phone by Martin, and the interrogation leader himself goes and picks up Martin at the parents' residence. Statements that of course were changed and adjusted in later manufactured post-constructed explanations. This is thus totally contradictory descriptions and can never be diminished to simple mistakes. In such a serious situation as during the same night that Sweden's Prime Minister has been shot, and investigating police and the victim's own son would have mistaken these basic details. It instead explains the completely decisive and obvious revelation that the interrogation never even took place, with the alleged involved. But it is precisely here one understands that it was about a direct cover-up of the Palme murder because the content in the hastily constructed interrogation, already hours after the shots, would via Martin's pointing out, be about trying to pin the mad Austrian Walter Kirisitz, already during the murder night for the murder. You surely understand then the much more reasonable and how Homer later described it as that he only got away because he happened to have a police alibi at the time of the murder. Not that he was completely innocent, even though the Palme fake investigation has tried to memory hole most about the early pointing out already during the murder night. There is still evidence for how this person was wanted and then brought in for interrogation already in the morning the day after, before he with his 100% police alibi could be removed as suspect and then cleaned away from the course of events with subsequent post-constructed explanations to who really was responsible for the pointing out. And for those who are completely uncomprehending to these statements that Martin for so many years has claimed about the man he saw would have followed after the couple on Swedish, all these statements are contradicted by a much more credible witness, Pia Engström, who was one of those who were at the same movie showing as the Palme couple. She knew it was the couple she followed with her gaze when she coincidentally just stood waiting for the bus, at a bus stop on Swedish, at the height of the place where the Palme couple said goodbye to the son and his girlfriend. Pia namely saw no one who followed the Palme couple when they walked along Swedish south, as far as she could see, all the way to the street grill outside Adolf Fredriks Church. Statements that Pia gave early to the investigation and then stuck to all the way up in the trial against Christer Pettersson. Pia, however, gave other certain statements about events in connection with her waiting for the bus that make her a very credible witness in the context. Even this contradiction of statements between two different people simply cannot be ignored, and in such a situation one must choose which witness to rely on in a serious and thorough investigation. It is also why one now understands that the son Martin's fabricated observation about a man who supposedly followed the Palme couple from the cinema and then fired the shots is a quick after-the-fact construction to point out an innocent scapegoat for the murder. Even considering how many and how different in appearance and details in people. Martin has later, over the years, identified as possible suspects. It only confirms that it has been a matter of whom the Palme investigation wanted to direct all its constructed current suspicions at any given moment. And the fact that Martin himself admitted in a radio recording how he adjusted his testimony depending on how confident a lead investigator was about a specific person should also reveal how involved Martin was in the cover-up work. We are accounting here for two important parts in understanding what really happened after the murder. Two different types of statements that never can be bypassed in the descriptions that are available. In the first case, a course of events is described so contradictory between the two participating parties that there can only be one single explanation, that it reasonably never can have played out in the way they describe. It is a constructed description of a course of events whose only motive has been a safe pointing out of the person one deliberately and intentionally wanted to try to pin for the murder. Which means that one already knows what happened at the murder site and who were involved. It also applies to the persons one has erased from the equation, to avoid the truth behind the exercise and what the planned meeting at the advertising pillar outside Die Karima really was about. What was a prerequisite for the execution to be carried out without Swedes understanding what was going on. Then, in connection with the top-secret stay-behind exercise, a professional killer could be placed well-planned in the Die Karima corner who well-planned could stand and wait to simply and smoothly carry out the cold slaughter through the execution of Sweden's Prime Minister. It is thus already in these contradictory accounts that we understand how the cover-up happened, and why so many have had difficulties being able to explain what really happened in connection with the murder. It is also revealing events in connection with the early cover-up that describe in what way the fake investigation, with support from media, succeeded in disinform and brainwash both the population and witnesses to succeed with the cover-up. Besides that, they succeeded in cleaning away a central person and a pleasant meeting and conversation at the advertising pillar from the course of events completely in the official narrative despite witnesses' concrete statements. They also succeeded in getting people to believe that the cinema visit was very late planned and that no one could know that the couple would go to the cinema this evening, or which film, or cinema it would be about. Or for that matter if the couple would walk home this cold February evening. This they succeeded with, despite there being so many concrete and factual evidence that explains that it does not match. Which will also describe what is decisive to solve this entire tragic history. But for all who really want to understand how such a cover-up happened in 1986, it is just to understand how revealing that witnesses have been handled. For example, the central witness Marelius called the police the day after the murder and told the very central and what he saw in connection with the event. It then took almost 2 weeks before Marelius got to come to a first interrogation, which one with knowledge and experience of analyzing clearly shows that this interrogation revealingly was confrontational against one of the most important witnesses at the murder site. The interrogation leader's aggressive way in questioning physical distance details in his temporary parking lacks absolute relevance if one wanted help to solve the case for real. Statements were questioned in a rule-violating way and Marelius did not get in accordance with applicable policy directly explain in his own words what happened. Add to that how the Palme fake investigation planted thousands of disinforming stories, the strangely found placed bullets, the fabricated weapons that a covering investigation leader sat and waved with at a press conference, and all incorrect statements in media that the victim was shot from the front, in connection with the conversation. And the newspaper article that even the son Martin would have been at the murder site after the shots and tried to save the father's life. A really fabricated story that never was corrected in media afterward. It was thus only about getting out as much disinformation as possible, to make witnesses insecure about what they really had experienced. Especially also the statement about how few minutes it would have been about before police and ambulance came to the scene, which is precisely what one wanted to achieve before one took in one of the most central witnesses, Marelius, for interrogation. Not to mention in what way one interrogated the witness Jepsen, who could account for the strange police behaviors up on the ridge, who in an incredibly confrontational interrogation more or less accused of being involved in the murder to scare the witness to silence. Or the example with the fantastic artist Wennerling who made the detailed sketches from Grand and who they knew had a proper and correct memory image of Olof Palme's friend Theo. She was shown thousands of pictures, completely against all rules at the time of the murder, just to try to wash away the correct image that Wennerling had on her retina of Olof Palme's friend, who only checked if Palme really made it to the cinema he already had been informed about. Even how state television in the first broadcast after the murder chose to diminish statements from witnesses about two men in dark coats with southern appearance, statements that so early were assessed as very uncertain. How can one already hours after assess statements from witnesses as very uncertain, if one hardly knows what happened? Then one should not even influence witnesses to evaluate the information but just collect as much as possible. Which is precisely what reveals how state media was involved in the cover-up already hours after the murder. We are accounting here for these right and witness psychological details that explanations and revelations have their real substance. And in connection with that, one very remarkably with support from state media went out with pictures and a phantom image. There is also the completely decisive evidence for who persons were involved in events on Swedish on the murder evening, by Holmer so early taking help from Germans from NATO headquarters in Wiesbaden and their signalment machine. Despite the same machine being available in Norway at the time of the murder, and they then succeeded in creating a phantom image of the person a witness saw while later in the evening in a narrow alley a bit from the murder site. This phantom image that created big headlines all over the world but which later revealingly only was assessed as a mistake by Holmer that more or less destroyed the investigation. The problem is just that the phantom image really is similar to the professional killer Anthony White, so why would it then be a mistake to publish this? Because they already knew everything about what happened at the murder, which is also confirmed by the statement that a Säpo-employed witness saw White and Säpo's premises days after the murder. The point with the phantom image was thus a completely different one. It was about luring in witnesses to the fake investigation, so that witnesses would be controlled and could be silenced, in connection with one then finding out what they knew and what they had seen. What also confirms that this really worked, as a covering measure, is the witness Robert, who on the murder evening was run over by a man in black coat and a chimney sweep hat above the stairs at the Ridge. This person was thus shown up on several places standing at the murder site when the camera pans past. It was in connection with such a showing on TV that the witness contacted the Palme fake investigation and told who she had been run over by up on the Ridge. Completely unexpectedly, it is precisely this witness that one then does everything to suspect and diminish by boldly simply moving where the event would have occurred to another street. We also have the fantastic account from the so-called Finns, who just minutes before the shots themselves were fired on Svevigen, encountered a policeman at the intersection Svevigen and Tunnelgaten, whom one of the Finns recognized and asked in Finnish if he knew what time it was. A person who both talked on walkie-talkie and had a weapon in hand, visible at the future murder site. A story that many years after the murder randomly came to light, as the Finns had promised each other never to tell anyone about it. This policeman was also in several strange sequences filmed by state television, once in the background of an interview where he is seen pretending to talk on a walkie-talkie outside Rosenbad in Stockholm, and then at the murder site receiving flowers. Also that the Finns would contact the investigation and make themselves known since they recognized the policeman from a gym in northern Stockholm. And when the covering gang tries to wave away and diminish this identification, they forget that the Finn actually directly asked what time it was in Finnish, which the man then spoke on his walkie-talkie. Then one must ask the question? Who would have chance speaking Finnish with someone on a street in Stockholm, if one did not know that he actually did and who it was? Yet another example that the identification was correct, from a reasonable purely statistical objective perspective. That then the whole story has been downplayed and diminished in relation to all the statements that engaged journalists managed to get at that time, testifies that precisely this person was part of the course of events on the murder evening. What his role really reasonably was, we will get to later. It can also be added that this person later became a parliamentarian and a prominent figure in Swedish politics, which shows that the establishment backed him, especially as the dedicated journalist Sven Einar long really named and pointed out this person for involvement in the murder, just to force a prosecution that could clarify what his role really had been. Something that the policeman never bid on, because then the risk would have existed that the entire covering and what was going on the murder evening came to light. The hunt for the Finns went on for several years, as even several years later inserts still mention police that there were persons they still sought, who could help in the matter, even in connection with the placing of Christer Pettersson had reached the end of the road, despite the fake investigation knowing exactly what had happened on the murder evening and instead only being interested in silencing all witnesses and killing all loose threads around the investigation. This is something that the world around must take in and understand. That the covering strategy to lure in witnesses to be silenced very well may have occurred in other cases, in a similar way. Revealing it is also about the showings of the phantom image, the man with chimney sweep hat, and the policeman at the murder site shortly before the murder, that they also would be hammered into the population as all these video sequences were rolled once again in the news. Reporting's Year Review 1986 that many Swedes sat and watched by tradition. Also in a report from the Investigation 1990, the police still wanted to get in touch with witnesses that they knew had seen things they had not reported about, which only confirms that the whole grip to show up persons involved in activities on the murder evening on prime time in state television only was done to lure in witnesses into the covering to be silenced. Which also leads us into the completely decisive video clip that as late as 2022 was uploaded on YouTube, which just was about a program about Olof Palme's friends in the small village Machos on Crete, where revealingly there was a long interview with Theophilos Souranakis, where the camera very revealingly zooms in Theo, in connection with the interview. This is of course the clip that completely decided the concrete substance for this investigation, when it finally became crystal clear who the grand man and the person that the Palme couple met at the advertising pillar actually was. When a picture of this Theo was compared with the witness Wennerling's sketch of the grand man with all the very spot-on distinct details in the face, it became completely clear that this was the covered key to the entire Palme murder. It was then the insight came that this concrete image evidence breakthrough never will be able to be waved away, which later only was proven by all interested in the Palme murder, refusing to deal with the person and the task that Theo could have been involved in the events on Svevigen. Considering the pictures of Theo and Palme together in September 1985, one understood of course early that Theo never had been aware of what would happen to Olof after their short meeting at the advertising pillar. Also the reactions in his irrational actions after the shots testify that he was completely in shock. But in the direct covering that was carried out just days after the murder, it became part of the same pattern to ship Theo home to Crete again, to record this film where they are to give the appearance that they only wanted to know how the people in the village reacted to the news about what had happened to their very famous and admired vacationing person. It is namely so that in September 1985 Olof Palme was appointed honorary citizen in the small village, and as a gift Palme got a house that was an inheritance in the family to precisely the mayor Theo. In connection with statements coming forward that South African agents as late as in September 1985 even were on Crete and that Craig Williamson has had a boat in the Mediterranean, the two Lises, lying in Pyros outside Athens, it was not so difficult to draw conclusions that it probably was South African regime representatives who were behind both the so-called bribe and to get a hold on Olof as a possibility to blackmail him. Precisely this private gift to Olof may have been what made Olof and Theo want to keep their friendship away from the spotlight, considering the short meeting at the advertising pillar, since it at the time of the murder also was another financial tax history that affected the trust for the Prime Minister in the so-called Harvard affair. When Olof guest lectured at a university in the USA without compensation, but which then meant that his son got a study place at. There were big headlines around this history, as the tax authority thought that Olof should be benefit taxed for it. When one well understands that it was an early cover-up of the fake investigation and that all focus was put on instead trying to solve the case in another way and try to pin a scapegoat instead of those who really were involved in the murder itself, one understands also how far too far the entire this cover-up had been driven. When they even had succeeded with deliberately and intentionally getting a completely innocent person convicted in Swedish court for the murder, despite they already, minutes after the shots on Svevigen, knew exactly what had happened and who were behind. It was therefore that it became problematic for the fake investigation when it over 10 years after the murder struck down like a bomb in the world when a South African agent, Eugene de Kock, from the apartheid regime during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, told how they also were behind the murder of Olof Palme 10 years earlier. De Kock pointed out both who was behind the operation, Craig Williamson, and also statements about who held the weapon on Swedish, Anthony White. Statements that showed to come from the whistleblower Rian Stander, who also worked in Craig Williamson's company Longrich, where he knew most about what happened around the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. It was thus already 1994 that Boris Ersson got the statements directly from Rian Stander about who were behind the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister 1986. Statements that Boris documented and left to the Palme fake investigation already 1994. Concrete and factual statements that the fake investigation just let be until the bomb was dropped 1996 during the trials in South Africa. Then Swedish investigators were forced down unwillingly to disinform and mislead in strange revealing pretend interrogations, with among others the pointed out persons. Just that the investigators bought straight off that Craig would not have been in Sweden since the end of the 70s, despite a very credible witness seeing him at a conference in Stockholm a week before the murder, that Swedish police saw Craig in the International Police Association's premises during the murder night. There is also a witness who sat next to a nervous Craig on an airplane from Stockholm to Gothenburg the day after the murder, where he was seen taken by persons through a side entrance upon arrival at the destination. When it comes to Anthony White, he had, according to statement, never been Sweden, despite a Sapo-employed witness pointing him out in Sapo's premises days after the murder. In connection with this tangle receiving international attention, it became an external pressure for a period on the fake investigation, which shows how important it is that international forces put pressure on Swedish covering authorities to actually take on this tragic open wound that a large part of the population still suffers from. What at least caused the tension forced the fake investigation to as late as 1996 hold an interrogation with Boris Ersson about all the statements he collected already 1994, and all the contact he had with the terrified Rian Stander the years after they met. The interrogation that was held at the police in Luleå 1996 is the very most revealing documentation that exists around the entire Palme fake investigation. There are incredibly concrete statements about that Rian had documentation on how much the professional killer Anthony White got in money for the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. Also from which account the money has been paid out. In the conversations between Boris and Rian, it also becomes clear that all walkie-talkie observations around the Palme couple on the murder evening were by Swedes and had nothing to do with the South Africans. It also came out that Craig had had contact with some female chief whom they could no longer contact after the act was carried out, which indicates that it was precisely the Palme couple's friend Anthusa, in the village Machos on Crete, who despite everything was the Palme couple's primary contact and the one that Theo answered to. With knowledge of Theo's involvement in the events on the murder evening and Rian's statements about Olof Palme and black money, one can also draw conclusions that it actually was in this way that the South African agents tried to get at Olof and via Theo succeed in provoking a meeting, a cold February evening in Stockholm outside Dikarema on the way home from a movie. Both with the wife in tow and really no suspicion that an execution would be carried out. Considering that a witness saw a terrified Theo flee from the site of the murder and the meeting with a bag in hand, there is reason to believe that it may have been the content of the bag that the short meeting at the advertising pillar may have been about. It is just to note that precisely as the stubborn police commissioner, ringed in geographically, in his report the involved in the murder, came from Crete and South Africa, and it is precisely therefore that Theo is the key person to solving the entire case. And it is therefore that it now can be described in detail what actually happened at the murder site, mostly based on all the witness statements that have knowledgeably been analyzed and combined in a single reasonable course of events. And revealingly, it is none of all those who continue to cover up the murder who even want to touch the completely decisive key person, Theo. In this part we will go through the most vital descriptive sequences for what happened at the murder site. We will use images from reconstructions with witnesses taken shortly after the murder, as well as the police's own photographs from the crime scene taken days after the murder. It is also important to understand that in some reconstruction images the actual moment of the shots was recreated a short distance from the precise murder location because a huge pile of flowers affected the execution of the reconstructions. Therefore, the main focus has been placed on images showing the blood pool and the marking that indicated the area within which the blood spatter was located. This is also extremely important because the direction of the blood spatter and the area it covered, as documented by the early crime scene technicians, directly contradicts all official claims about where the bullets that were later planted could possibly have been found. So to begin with understanding the important and concrete statements that lead up to what later unfolds at the murder site, we have the northbound witness Fauzian Svevigen, which the first image describes very well. This reconstruction image is important because a witness sees the Palme couple walking south on Svevigen, but also because a man is walking about 10 meters behind the Palme couple, whom the witness states is too old to be a bodyguard. Thus the witness has understood who the couple is that he has just passed, and that the person may have had some connection to the couple but did not fit the profile given his reflection. The man is described by the witness as wearing a blue padded jacket. This is therefore Olof Palme's friend Theo. The time here is calculated to approximately 40 seconds before the shots, based on an estimation of how far the witness managed to walk from the meeting before he heard the shots. Approximate time, 23 hours 19 minutes and 30 seconds. The next important sequence in the course of events is the meeting itself at the advertising pillar, farthest to the left in the image. The statements about the meeting with the three persons are built on concrete information from a taxi driver sitting in his car on Svevigen waiting at a red light, and his description of a conversation at the advertising pillar outside Dikarema, where the witness can even place the persons in relation to each other. The Palme couple stands with their backs to the taxi driver, and the person they are talking with stands with his back to the facade. That is Theo, here in the lighter blue color. In the very first radio reports from police about the description, which came from the taxi driver, he states that the man he saw was wearing a blue padded jacket. Even the witness Bjorkman, looking south in search of possibly arriving friends, here in darker blue, experiences that the three persons are having a pleasant time, and in his first interrogation on the murder night he states that the man was wearing a blue padded jacket, as long as his own and was as tall as himself. It is also in connection with this waiting position that Bjorkman states that a person passed by, and it is here temporally that it fits for one of the much later accused suspects, the witness Stig Engström in a dark coat, to pass both Bjorkman and the meeting and then turn into Tunnelgaten, to check the time on his wristwatch in the light from the Dikarema store. A statement he later uses as an emergency lie on Svevigen. The time here is set to approximately 23 hours 20 minutes and 10 seconds. We also see how the taller waiting professional killer in a long dark coat stands at Dikarema's bevel, hidden from the meeting participants but well prepared to then simply step forward and carry out the planned execution, once the Palme couple has finished the short meeting and passes by. In the next important sequence, the Palme couple has finished the meeting and is walking south on Svevigen. Here comes the completely decisive moment of the shots, as described by the witness Marelius, on the other side of the intersection, where he is sitting in his car, simply waiting for friends to withdraw money from an ATM. He has already had his attention on a strangely behaving waiting perpetrator, at the bevel of the Dikarema corner for several minutes, and then sees the Palme couple coming. And it is precisely then that the perpetrator steps up behind and fires 2 shots in rapid succession at Olof Palme. Something deviant that the witness has already noticed about the waiting man, that something is about to happen. He even manages to say to one of the friends getting into the car that he thought the man might snatch a bag. There is thus a real anchoring in the detailed statements, combined with descriptions of an actual course of events. It is also this witness who stated that the execution of the Prime Minister was a slaughter, by a butcher, who knew exactly what he was doing. The same witness also contradicts all official claims that Lisbeth Palme was injured by shot, by stating that both shots were fired only at Olof Palme. The time here is set to 23 hours 20 minutes and 26 seconds. It is based on a calculation of a time indication from the witness's girlfriend's ATM receipt, 2318, which was later clarified to 23 hours 18 minutes and 56 seconds. However, the ATM clock was running 90 seconds slow, and the shots fell at 23 hours 20 minutes and 26 seconds. In the next sequence, in the next image, we have the witness Engström in a dark coat fleeing into Tunnelgaten after hearing the shots fall behind his back, and behind him the perpetrator and professional killer Anthony White also disappears, also in a dark coat. Thus 2 persons in dark coats disappearing into Tunnelgaten, which is supported by the very early witness statements reported in the first television news broadcasts, but which the police very quickly and revealingly tried to diminish as very uncertain. Which sharply raises the crucial question: how can the police know that witness statements are uncertain just hours after the murder if one is not trying to cover up and mislead regarding these highly relevant and decisive statements? Which of course reveals the direct cover-up more than anything else. It is also important to understand where the completely erased person, Olof Palme's friend Theo from Crete, went after the meeting. He thus remains standing at the advertising pillar after the meeting and is shocked by the shots. He then disappears into a nook, an opening in the property, which is Di Karima's goods entrance. This statement too is supported by the witness Fozzie's account when, after a while, he sees the same blue padded jacket disappear into the building. It therefore cannot be the same person who fired the shots and disappeared into Tunnelgaten. There are also other witness statements about how this person later runs northeast of the murder site, in a terrified and panicked zigzag pattern, while everyone else has their full attention on what is happening at the murder site. There is also descriptive support for this course of events from the witness Bjorkman when he later in interrogation realized that it was a person Palme met at the advertising pillar, and that the perpetrator may have been standing waiting around the corner of the building. We also have a very important witness on Tunnelgaten who hears someone being shot at the murder site and sees someone fall to the ground. He then hears someone running behind the barracks, and the witness follows the person he believes is the perpetrator up the stairs to the ridge. The problem is only that it is the fleeing and mistaken witness Engström whom the witness Jepsen sees and has full focus on. He simply misses that the real perpetrator disappears north on Lundmakargatan, behind his back, while he is completely focused on the fleeing Engström running up the stairs, which he then bravely tries to follow and search for. This is the central course of events that unfolds at the murder site, and the most central involved persons and important witnesses and their statements, which are built on the thorough examination of the statements these witnesses have given over the years. This absolutely does not fit with the official truths we have heard hammered in by authorities and the entire establishment for decades, that Theo would not even have been part of the course of events, that the perpetrator did not run up the stairs but that it was the witness Engström, who was even a hero in the context when he stopped the Honorable Police Commissioner Soderstrom on his way back to the murder site, to tell what he had experienced. This commissioner, who became the first police officer on the scene, after as long as approximately 9 minutes after the shots were fired. The time set to 23 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds. Engström, once back at the murder site, realized how he had been mistaken for the murderer, running into Tunnelgaten, and then realized it was best to invent an alternative story about arriving after the shots at the murder site, to avoid being taken in himself, as a possible scapegoat for the murder. When he so obviously lies and changes his story about what he did and contributed to fit all the time shifts that the Palme fake investigation makes, to clean away the simultaneous stay-behind exercise. These are several major decisive revelations that the Swedish population has never heard before from the Swedish establishment in 40 years. It is this description of a reasonable course of events, with concrete and factual support in witness statements, that we need help from abroad to reveal, so that the Swedish population can finally heal its open wound once and for all, in our only unsolved Prime Minister murder. And it is also these concrete reality-anchored witness statements, and the methods to analyze the material that have then served as the foundation for continuing the critical work of understanding the whole behind the murder and the cover-up. That is why many others who have dug over the years have never gotten further. They have not had the competence to understand what really happened, or want to understand and dare to challenge what we have been fed over the years. But with a truly critical approach, distancing oneself from the official truths, and completely focusing on the actual content in different witnesses' descriptions in their statements, it was possible. Which we will now come to. When one distances oneself from the covering official narrative and understands exactly what happened at the murder site and the strange activities around the Palme couple all that evening, all the other puzzle pieces fall into place. That witnesses observed events around the couple that in broad strokes completely contradict the statements Lisbeth and son Martin later gave, one understands that unfortunately they have been part of the cover-up. Now that Theo has been so grossly erased from the entire course of events, despite the clear differences in description between the grand man and the man the couple met at the advertising pillar, compared to the ice-cold slaughterer, the professional killer from southern Africa who stood waiting for several minutes at the Di Karima corner, one at least understands who was involved in activities around the murder site. Add the obvious persons who later were shown in strangely witness-luring revealing ways on state television, and you get a clear picture of how large the activity was and who was involved in different parts of the murder evening. Add to that approximately 80 different witness observations, from various people, about men with walkie-talkies around the Palme couple and places they would later pass, at the same time as the Palme fake investigation does everything to diminish and wave away these observations, which of course had nothing to do with the South African perpetrators. One understands much more about how this could have happened. Because there is no reasonableness in the coincidence that at the same time as the execution is carried out by the ice-cold professional killer from southern Africa, a top-secret stay-behind exercise is taking place. Led by the Swedish security service with support from resources from the former Säpo chief and now county police chief in Stockholm, Hans Holmer. When one also understands that the South African regime's agents around Europe have carried out acts on behalf of Western security services, many against the communist ANC, one also understands that the South African regime never could have carried out the act without both a clear green light from Western leadership at the highest level and without a cover from the at the time top-secret Western NATO-founded stay-behind organization. One understands how high up this act has its anchoring. Here too there are concrete and factual statements around the murder from a whistleblower in the USA, Gene Chip Tatum, who in a radio interview revealed what he was told in connection with becoming involved in OSG, the secret American organization that carried out operations to murder prominent and problematic persons and cause regime changes around the world. Statements that clearly pointed to the order to execute the Swedish Prime Minister, coming from George Bush Sr. and carried out by South African agents. Which was exactly what happened. We listened to that clip.
Was Bush involved in any complicity with that? Was it the foreign minister who was killed in Sweden?
Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was assassinated. I'm told it was by the OSGs, and they used an asset out of southern Africa.
I see. So, and why was he neutralized?
End-user certificates that were very important during the Iran-Contra, what would they call the Iran-Contra, for the weapons that were being shipped around the world. Mm-hmm. Without an end-user certificate, it's very difficult to move the weapons into areas without violating international law and ending up in prison. So they needed end-user certificates for a lot of these upgraded weapons rather than just the M16s. Sweden was a primary area to use it because there was a weapons company out of Sweden that North wanted to use. So, from what I understand, he laid the whole plan out to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister wouldn't have anything to do with it and was going to turn it over to the international community because it was illegal.
Mm-hmm. And that was his undoing.
And it's historic now. Yeah.
According to whistleblower Chip, George Bush Sr., who was also CIA chief for a period, ordered the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. Considering that Carl Colby, son of William Colby who laid the foundation for Stay Behind in Sweden already in the 1950s, has stated that he heard there was an exercise taking place in Stockholm on the murder evening at the same time. There is no doubt that this exercise very well could have been the cover for the attack itself. William Colby later also became CIA chief, as many probably already know. There is also a peace researcher, Ola Tunander, who with his insight into how Stay Behind operated in different countries during the Cold War, has also confirmed that many acts and regime changes took place under the cover of Stay Behind exercises. Tunander has also accounted for how the Swedish Security Service conducted an investigation of the course of events around the murder site itself and concluded that the scenario resembles a coup defense exercise, an execution attempt, on an information carrier one needs to liquidate. Which is also what explains the visible policeman at the murder site a while before the murder who was identified by the so-called Finns. Everything thus indicates that it was this person who acted as the planned scapegoat, or patsy, in the exercise scenario on the murder evening. Especially as he over his walkie-talkie received the order to continue with the mission despite being recognized at the murder site, minutes before the shots. The starting point is that even he was completely unaware of what was really going to happen in connection with the Palme couple passing the Dikarima corner, and the ice-cold slaughterer going into action. So it was never a question of coincidence with the simultaneous exercise. All of this is also evidenced by the last phone call Olof Palme made on the murder evening before the couple went to the cinema, which was precisely a call to Sven Aspling, who was a member of Stay Behind, and it is obvious that it may have concerned a final check before the evening's activities, in connection with the exercise. Just as hinted in statements, there was a purely private reason for the meeting between the Palme couple taking place where it did, outside Dikarima on the way home from the cinema. This meeting can thus very well have been provoked via threats from Craig and his South African colleagues, since Craig himself stated that the act was about dirty arms deals and that Olof, in connection with this, handled black money. In connection with this short meeting, a Stay Behind exercise was thus arranged on the murder evening, and one of the advantages was to avoid Palme having bodyguard protection that could jeopardize the operation. And that Olof himself so carelessly would have gone to a dangerous meeting with his wife this cold late February evening, without a single thought that something bad could happen, can be explained by Olof trusting Theo and the entire Stay Behind organization, and with all the resources that Swedish security services provided. That is why throughout the investigative work it has been emphasized that no Swede is reasonably involved or aware of the planned execution. At the time of the murder in Sweden in the 80s, it would have been more or less unthinkable that an authority representative could have been involved. Regardless of whether it looks like Western security services, from 1982, deep in cooperation with the Swedish Security Service and a specific selected police traveled to South Africa on guerrilla combat trainings, via the International Police Association's direction to, in accordance with Stay Behind's operations, being able to operate in the country after a potential Soviet takeover. It is also here that naive statements from government representatives fit in so well with what actually happened, that they really did not see it coming when everyone was completely set on how already Western aligned Sweden, Swedish military, and security services were. That Sweden unofficially was already the 17th NATO member at the time of the murder. And as Michael Holmström has written about in his book, that a high-ranking Swedish military person already during the murder night was prepared to travel to the West to continue defending Sweden if it was about a Soviet invasion that began with a prime minister murder. He was just waiting for clearance from the government, which revealingly never came because they knew it was the West behind it. It is also here that one easily gets a reasonable explanation for how the vice prime minister just takes a taxi into the city, without more serious protection. Why police at the murder scene tell something completely different to other police than what really happened and who was affected. So the only remaining question about why the Western powers, with George Bush Sr. at the helm, would have ordered a murder of a secretly allied leader of Palme's stature in the world, at the time of the murder? Why would Swedish government representatives, authorities, and media do everything to cover up the murder and at the same time put the entire Swedish democratic legal system out of play, in something that even explains Holmer's statement that Swedish society will change fundamentally? Why has no other political force in Sweden over the years wanted to reveal what really happened during the 40 years that the entire Swedish establishment has covered up the murder, and offered Swedish lone madmen as accused perpetrators, on a conveyor belt? What is it that makes that just hours after the murder, Swedish police began deliberate activities in the hunt to pin a completely innocent for the murder, precisely in line with the scapegoat Lee Harvey Oswald, in the John F. Kennedy murder? What is the motive, that it was only about Olof Palme and nothing more? Just as it has already been accounted for in the context during the Cold War, there were many possible reasons and motives to limit Olof Palme's voice and engagement in the world. There is probably no one who did not understand what impact Palme had in the world, especially the voice for the weak and vulnerable that he stood up for. The fight against the oppression from the apartheid regime in South Africa as an example. Others have highlighted the corrupt arms trade with India as a possible cause. Palme's impending meeting with the Soviet Union's leader Gorbachev and negotiations about nuclear-free zones have also been cited as possible reasons. Different theories that have been named, traitor track, in connection with military submarine violations in Swedish waters during the 80s. The problem is just that the concrete information around who could have arranged a top-secret stay-behind exercise as cover for the execution, and that Swedish government representatives choose to just smooth over and cover up the entire murder, makes that it only can be Western security services behind the murder itself. And when it comes to political leaders in Western countries, and specifically in the case of a Swedish democratically elected prime minister, who is even considered to belong to the West at the time of the murder, even if they officially pretend to play neutral, one understands that the motive should be serious and in some form well-founded, even conveyed in precise threats. It is precisely here that the fantastic whistleblower Arnold Sundquist's story from 2022 confirms most of what reasonably lay behind the murder itself, especially in the clear threats directed from American top level against Olof Palme personally on several occasions. It is also a fantastic story from reality from a person whose life is unique, in the context and in what way this person chose to tell about the dramatic events shortly before the murder on the Prime Minister. It was thus in connection with the Swedish Social Democratic Defense Minister going after a newer party and referring to their previous history that Arnold chose to go out with what the Social Democrats had been involved in before. Everyone should of course listen to Arnold's own story themselves, in its entirety, but to at least pick out the most essential, here is a short summary. Arnold, as export controller for American account, was asked to go to Sweden and find out if Bofors delivered weapons with American components to active wars in the Middle East. Arnold with his contacts went to Bofors' office and got serial numbers on the Robot 70 that had been exported abroad. After American military sank a fast Iranian patrol boat in the Persian Gulf of Swedish manufacture, they could confirm that both boats, but mainly a Bofors-manufactured Robot 70, had the same serial numbers as those Bofors exported. They dug further, and then found that Robot 70 was exported via a police chief in Malaysia, via a Swedish company where the rulers were former SAPO chiefs and also a high-ranking social democrat, and that the whole arrangement was created by Olof Palme himself, to be able to decoy smuggle Robot 70 to the now warring nation Iran. These fast patrol boats with Volvo engines manufactured by Bagamars on Ladingo, with high-tech Robot 70 with American components, thus did great damage to ship traffic in the Persian Gulf during 1985. When this was revealed, American authorities and embassy contacted Olof Palme personally and pointed out both this and that Sweden helped Gaddafi in Libya build a submarine harbor, attached with a list of all the people they knew were involved, which was not something the Americans looked brightly on. They also knew that money went to activities on the Americans' backyard in South America, and they were not happy with that. Here in connection with this also comes concrete and relevant information in the problems with Palme's dirty secret activities, namely the specific threats that were conveyed to Olof Palme personally. Namely that if not Palme stopped what he was doing, then the last Volvo car was sold in the USA. Viggen will not lift again, and the planned new fighter plane JS Gripen will never happen. Considering it was during the Cold War days. Considering how much money Swedish car and arms manufacturing contributed to Sweden's prosperity, these threats of measures were completely devastating for Sweden, if they became reality. It was also not a question of any negotiation but just clear instructions that should be followed to the letter, otherwise the measures would be carried out. It also says a lot about what relation Sweden, but also the Prime Minister, had to the current American administration. Palme, of course, did what was expected of the Americans, but as Arnold also fills in with later in his story, about what happened a time afterward, there is an obvious continuation, that it is these dirty arms deals that may have been the basis for the Americans getting totally tired of Palme's actions that they had previously been so clear about how they wanted handled. Information is known that there was an order from Iran for 400 Robot 70 from Bofors. First, only half was delivered during 1985, and information indicates that during December 1985 there was a plan to deliver the rest of the weapons to Iran, and one of the measures from Palme then became to act and dirtily accuse Arnold for industrial espionage, just because Arnold cheekily had stepped into the office at Bofors and got the serial numbers he asked for. It is that story that Arnold later tells about in his review, and how he had to hide in his underground helicopter hangar for the sent Swedish security police was hunting him. And that Arnold then managed in a remarkable way to get via boat to Denmark, and then in safety to the USA. Once there, Arnold told what he had been subjected to, and then the American administration contacted Olof Palme once again, and in this position it was just clear orders about what Olof should do around the handling of Arnold, and that it was clear that no one in Sweden could do anything bad to Arnold in the future. But what also revealingly decides a possible intent and motive is the demand that more people from the Swedish government were required to be involved and aware of the arisen situation this time. Here it becomes obvious, with this whole background as basis, that Palme more or less signed his own death sentence, and that it was therefore that other influential governing people should be present as a possible preparation for what later would happen to Palme. That no one would be able to question what Palme himself had caused, and that there were clear motives for why the American administration could no longer have an allied partner who refused to comply with the demands the American administration made on, among others, the countries that bought American components, developed advanced war material, and earned big money from it. According to Arnold, the last mentioned event would have taken place the month before Palme was executed, and here the order and the green light should reasonably have gone out to South Africa via the Italian P2 Lodge to carry out the assassination and then mask it in a simultaneous stay-behind exercise. First, after provoking a meeting between Theo and Palme, that Palme himself planned and placed outside illuminated Dikorama, on the way home from an already booked movie. It is here the explanations that the victim himself chose the murder place get their long-awaited reasonable explanation. Considering it was the Swedish security police who held the exercise during the murder night, and that there was already personnel in the police's liaison center at the time of the murder, it is not so difficult to understand that also information about a secret Sapo exercise that was going on the murder evening named Così fan tutte, after an opera by Mozart, could be the name of just the exercise that happened around the Palme couple when he anyway would meet his friend Theo from Crete. The hushed events outside the cinema after the film, when a person acted threateningly against the Prime Minister, that a prosecutor threateningly hushed down, also indicate that it may have been part of the exercise. One absolutely did not want to come forward. Arnold's entire story and the content in it about the big problem with the fast Swedish patrol boats with harmful weapons in the Persian Gulf is also confirmed by the former employee in the American administration, Barbara Honegger, in her book, October Surprise, where she, in the chapter with the Swedish contact, accounts for the fast boats that caused great damage in the Persian Gulf. A book that is also quoted in one of the covering Swedish commissions over the years, but where the message about who should be the recipient of the telegram, that referred to it being clear that the Swedish tree would be felled, i.e. that Palme would be executed, revealingly has been edited away from the original message. When the recipient himself, Vice President Bush, has been removed. Which also gives evidence for how the Swedish commission works, that have been done around the murder, only have been about calming the public, which even one of the commission participants has stated, to seriously scrutinizing people. To also underline how credible and experienced the helicopter pilot and adventurer Arnold Sundqvist is as an informant, he has also been personal advisor to the current American President Donald Trump. And when one looks at all revealing reactions that also give evidence that a story is relevant and revealing, Arnold himself has stated that American CIA did not become happy that the whistleblower Arnold went out publicly and told about the thoroughly corrupt decoy smuggling deals that a very active Swedish arms selling and warmongering prime minister was doing at the time of the murder. That he even tried to silence Arnold through invented serious criminal accusations. Really dirty arms sales that went to warring nations, that at this time were against all Swedish rules for arms export. All this information is also well described and as evidence in the article that New York Times journalist Richard Reeves reported about just over a year after the murder. About how decisive and income-bringing the dirty arms deals were for Sweden as a country, and how involved Swedish prime ministers were in acting as arms dealers at the time of the murder. The trail of events that was effectively closed to investigators began in November 1980. Olof Palme, who had been defeated in the 1976 election, was bored and irritable as opposition leader. He missed the world spotlight that had played on him as a vehement opponent of the Vietnam War. He jumped when United Nations Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim asked him to try to mediate the bloody war between Iran and Iraq, then a year old. Until 1983, the year after he won re-election as Prime Minister, Palme continued to make trips to Iran and Iraq, shuttling between Tehran and Baghdad with an entourage from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Many of those diplomats stayed on in the warring capitals. Their presence led to the later suspicion that the government must have known of weapons shipments to Iran by Sweden's great arms manufacturer, the Bofors Group of Nobel Industries. Swedish law prohibits sales by Bofors and other private arms companies in war zones, which by Swedish definition includes much of the world, certainly the Persian Gulf and the entire Middle East. But Sweden is also a country that maintains its high standard of living. Per capita income is 25% higher than in the United States through foreign trade. Arms sales are part of that prosperity. Weapons may account for 5% or more of Sweden's annual exports of about $45 billion, which is more than a third of its gross national product. The government has been known to look the other way on weapons sales, liberally granting export permits that certified that material was not headed for war zones. Singapore was the favored shipping point for Bofors equipment, especially its highly regarded RBS-70 surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile launcher. From that port, the RBS-70s were sent on to, among other places, Iran, being transshipped a second time from Dubai or Bahrain. Then someone inside Bofors blew the whistle, leaking information on the deals to peace groups on the left wing of Palme's Social Democrats. Details began to leak out about a series of shipments between October of 1984 and May of 1985, apparently all headed toward Iran. Trainloads of Bofors gunpowder had been seized by customs officers in West Germany and Italy. Other trainloads and perhaps naval cannons had gotten through by way of Austria, Yugoslavia, and Singapore. 200 RBS-70s had been delivered to Iran, part of an order for 400 placed by the Iranian government. An additional 800 to 1,200 RBS-70s could not quite be accounted for, although they were known to have passed through Dubai and Bahrain. Directors of Bofors have insisted that the company has done nothing that was illegal or that was not known to the government. Palme, facing re-election in 1985, appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the sales. And he stopped the shipments at least for a time. Specifically, he blocked the 200 additional RBS-70s that Iran had ordered. Also, according to sources in the French Foreign Ministry, the Swedish Prime Minister ordered a ship loaded with 155mm howitzers stopped as it was leaving the port of Malmö bound for Dubai, and then, it is believed, Iran. An Iranian military delegation came to Stockholm to protest the stopping of deliveries. That was on February 4, 1986, 3 weeks before Palme's murder. The Iraqis, of course, had protested the sales when they became public. They were also enraged by a program that the Swedes considered an act of humanitarian neutrality. Iranian war wounded were being treated in Swedish hospitals for what the Iranians said were the effects of poison gas attacks launched by Iraq. It has also in recent years, when the Palme fake investigation has also found interest in bringing forward South Africa's involvement in the murder, existed concrete information that the Swedish state and government in South Africa chosen to put the lid on this entire event, despite there having been ideas to negotiate amnesty for the crimes with the involved South Africans, against them actually telling what happened on the murder evening and around the murder. Which obviously was what the last prosecutor, Christer Peterson, was on the way to achieve. In connection with him in February 2020, later would return with decision in prosecution question, which never can have been about an already deceased perpetrator. At the same time as he initially never even talked about closing the investigation. A prosecutor who previously made clear that he intended to drive the investigation all the way to retirement, which then would have been this year 2026. And once you come to understand what unlawful violations the cover-up of the murder has been guilty of, you get the explanation for all the other quotes that have surrounded the investigation over the years. One can also understand both Palme's actions, and what he believed in, but at the same time how it caused major problems for the West in controlling conflicts and events during the challenging days of the Cold War. One also understands the difficulty of explaining the background to the murder, with a prime minister acting as an arms seller, via front smuggling to warring countries and exposing Sweden to incredibly large risks in this dirty profitable trade. That Sweden was in principle already the 17th member of NATO, and that the top-secret stay-behind network had existed in Sweden for several decades, and that the person who built up that organization was a prominent person within the CIA. One can act with hindsight and speculate on whether the truths could have emerged earlier, if only one had played incompetent and naive, even in the investigative work. It is even possible to believe that understanding Swedes in general might have accepted a truth about the cover-up after a number of years, especially since the top-secret stay-behind organization became known in Sweden a few years after the murder. It is also understandable that the early measures of deliberately and intentionally pointing out, and in one case both prosecuting and convicting, a completely innocent person for the murder in a Swedish court, were what prevented the truth about the cover-up from coming out, without the entire Swedish establishment paying the price for what they had been involved in. But as most can now see, all of these explanations for what happened, by naive Swedish politicians, have already been addressed in all the information surrounding the fake investigation over the years. What is undoubtedly suggested in the concrete threats that investigative public figures received in writing, in connection with the concrete threats they were sent. It also leads us to who has been involved in the continued cover-up of the murder, and how such revealing actions have been carried out in many of the forums available for people interested in the murder over the years. This is where we return to parallels with many other ongoing murder cover-ups, such as the murder of Charlie Kirk, which is still ongoing in the aftermath, in alternative media. Even more important is it in this era, when ordinary people with knowledge and genuine engagement try to gather via the internet and help to scrutinize, share information, and investigate circumstances that happen in the world, that one better understands how revealing the reactions are, from the previously gatekeeping media, the deep states, in Western countries, and how exposed one becomes when one brings forward concrete information and evidence. In connection with the publication of the progress in this investigation, many remarkable reactions were revealed. First, the information was presented in document form, and then 3 years back, in video format on a channel on YouTube, with parallel activities in many Swedish forums. How one then directly rarely even gets a discussion about concrete evidence and possible deviant theories, but directly becomes diminished, mocked, idiot declared, character assassinated, and persecuted by people who so revealingly have connections to Swedish covering authorities and mass media contexts. Also the remarkable that this investigation has been presented for free, for all to scrutinize and criticize in front of a completely open curtain, for over 4 years, while others beg money from gullible people to continue spreading lies and diminutions of witnesses' real information and to continue parasitizing on the Palme murder. Then it becomes so obvious that it is only about suspecting purposes and labeling everything that does not match the official narrative as conspiracy theories. even from all those who obviously are both knowledgeable and interested in the Palme murder, and have been for so many years. And when one has also contributed with one's knowledge and been critical of others, who pretend to try to get the truth but really have been part of the continued cover-up, one has been threatened with both police reports and shutdown of the YouTube channel. Been thrown out from Palme murder forums, and a known so-called journalist shuts one off from a blog for 6 months just for trying to discuss the concrete dug-up information and images of interesting people. Also, membership in Palme murder-focused forums, one has been thrown out from completely without motivation, and one also gets no explanation when one asks about it. Instead, the deliberate deception against the truth-seeking people has become a parasitizing, economically lucrative industry with books, films, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels where society supports and notices all different types of homemade narratives and disinforming novels, to continue selling and earning money on this Swedish tragic event. When Sweden forever lost its innocence, an admirable innocent naivety. And for the cheek-kissing in the establishment who participated in the continued cover-up around it, both prizes and medals from the king are cashed in on a conveyor belt, while the population continues to be kept unaware in the dark, and at regular intervals just offered yet another new lone man to relate to. But above all, it is a total absence of constructive discussions around relevant information, such as both the example with Arnold Sundquist's story shortly before the murder, or the possibility that it was Olof Palme's friend Theo from Crete, who was on Swedish on the murder evening and could have been the person who unraveled this whole story. Instead, it is precisely here that all discussions have ceased and no one wants to take in information and revelations anymore. It is only about ignorance and focus shifts from the covering forces. That is why it is so effective to use parts from this investigation as tools to find other truth seekers to collaborate with. If one does not have an opinion about Arnold's story, even can have been the basis for what a month later happened on Swedish, it says a lot. If one is not even interested in considering Theo as the for almost 40 years sought so-called grand man, and if the man is in the so-called meeting scenario, it reveals even more about where one stands. It is precisely here other truth seekers can be inspired to use concrete evidence to reveal when official narratives are to be hammered in, to populations around the world, and which people one can invest in working with. But above all, it is about the sad realization that real relevant knowledge in actually interpreting, evaluating, and analyzing witnesses and other people's statements has been completely absent during almost the entire development of this investigation. There have hardly been any questions about sources, references, or discussions about relevant theories. Here there are interesting studies to do about how uninterested ignorant people are of real knowledge they do not have, or the question if those, who nevertheless realize the strength in it, also understand how decisive and perhaps frightening the truth is in what happened. Regardless, one cannot just wave away how practically relevant and effective the knowledge has been applied to the material in one of the world's largest unsolved murder investigations. Of course, there are also naive people, especially in Sweden, who have difficulty taking in that state television already days after the murder would have been involved in diminishing the most reliable witnesses' information about 2 men in dark coats who left the place tunnel-gated in, or that the same television would be involved in luring witnesses into the investigation, to be controlled and silenced by Swedish authorities. But when this thought has fallen into place, there is no longer any return. Then the insight, knowledge, experience, and knowledge that it actually happened has forever become part of how critical one should be to the future's brainwashing propaganda regardless of where it comes from. It becomes a form of public education based on historical experiences. In many of the affected people's tragic life destinies, there are also more important information to weigh into the whole in the cover-up. This entire investigative journey is well documented for all to take part in material on the YouTube channel since several years back. And today it is very easy to translate speech and documents between different languages without major efforts. And to finally deepen into the revealing information to understand, evaluate, and get confirmed that the answers to a cover-up can be very specified in threats and reactions from involved people, we return to the parliamentarian and his digging friends. As an example, Jerry Martinger refused to stop digging into circumstances around the murder and in the very powerful and legally abusive threats that were conveyed to people one wanted to scare, threaten, and silence. There were also revealing formulations that ring in what really happened. We have in concrete and police reported seriously meant messages been able to read formulations like, "What do you think you will succeed with? Getting the truth out? No you. Ha ha ha. It is not always best that the truth comes out, namely. It can actually be more important that a parliamentarian disappears if he knows too much. How the hell do you think it would be in Sweden if the information he provided would take hold? How do you think it would look then? Who would then regard Sweden as a rule of law state?" Also another person who got this. "No, talk your way out of this whole shit if you can. The best you can do now is to shut down your entire operation. For your own sake and for Sweden's sake. Do you want Sweden to still be a good country to live in, a rule of law state and a country where we have no poor? Then you must help so that the real truth does not come out. What happened was a one-time occurrence, and therefore it must be hidden." Revealing there is already a lot to draw in the formulations around the motives for the threats. That it is about a one-time occurrence, and that getting the truth out is not always the best, even so grossly, that a person can disappear to continue covering up the circumstances. It is also very revealing to hide Swedish authorities' abuses and how people would lose trust in Sweden, as a rule of law state. That everything is also motivated with economic conditions, can be brought into the discussion around how incredibly profitable this dirty warmongering arms trade has been over the years for the small innocent, pretend neutral hypocritical moral preaching country, up in the north, has been over the years. It is in this almost basic human context the true picture of this long since thoroughly corrupt country Sweden, with a completely deceived and naive brainwashed population, must come to an end and that the truth finally gets to come to the surface. And when the entire gathered establishment in Sweden, regardless of party affiliation left or right, continues to cover up everything, it must grow a more truthful and reality-based description of what country we really live in. And it is here the Swedish population is in great need of help from the rest of the world, to help the Swedish people heal their open wounds and be able to move on with the experiences into a better world. As surely most understand from the multi-year careful, serious, engaged, and knowledge-based work that has been the basis for this private investigation and this summarizing film, there is no longer any possibility that representatives of the Swedish establishment, in the form of politicians, authorities, or media, will do anything to bring revelations of those brought up in the film. They have long been involved in the cover-up, or involved in the culture of silence around it. What the Swedish population now places its last hope in is that the outside world notices how the country Sweden has handled this event and how such an innocent country has deceived and committed a form of psychological abuse against its own population for decades by fake investigating a prime minister murder on the open street that is still an open wound for so many Swedes. And how we have been brainwashed into that anyone among ourselves in the population, or someone within our authorities, could be a prime minister murderer and then get away with it. How the world's attention around the case and the cover-up indirectly can put such demands on Swedish representatives that it is no longer interesting to tourists or do business with Sweden until this murder has been investigated once and for all. It is also about saving and in extension possibly protecting Sweden from further ruin that may be caused by Sweden becoming a thoroughly corrupt country in connection with the cover-up of the act against the Prime Minister. One could even rephrase what Holmer said about Swedish society changing fundamentally if the truth came out, to that Swedish society really did change fundamentally, precisely because the truth did not come out. Sweden became thoroughly corrupt and an easy blackmail target for malicious dark driving forces around the world. But perhaps Swedish representatives just think it is a possible negligible price in the very profitable economically lucrative branch where one trades in, through rotten and dirty arms deals, with other countries that definitely do not contribute to tensions in the world decreasing. Many Swedes do not want to contribute to dirty economic profitable warmongering export and rhetoric from all the Swedish political representatives. They also do not want to contribute to so many innocent young men dying as cannon fodder in completely unnecessary Western proxy wars. For all who engage and understand the concrete evidence that exists, it is the knowledge in the investigative work and the knowledge about the methods that covering regimes have used that is the greatest gain for most who are still interested in understanding the world around us and are prepared to work for a better world for future generations. As when one, for example, well understands how involved the state's own propaganda organs were already in 1986, forcibly taxed by the population for decades, to brainwash the entire population in what they should believe about the murder and at the same time lure innocent witnesses into the covering fake investigation, to be silenced. This is an example of a purely democratic public education task and experience. Such a one that can awaken populations that previously had an unhealthy, uncritical attitude to establishments in Western countries. That it is basically simple. Without having reality-based, well-informed citizens who are to vote and decide the governance in countries at regular intervals, it becomes difficult to call our countries real democracies, if we cannot take a stand on important issues that concern the country and its security. Hope everyone can help spread, share, and discuss the content in this film and all important revelations. Understand how hardworking, honest, open, a country's population like the Swedish can be so deceived by its own political representatives for so long. If it can hit Sweden, there are all possibilities that other countries are hit the same way. Therefore, it is in all good people's interest to bring forward what actually happens in the world. And with regard to the movement that is currently thriving on alternative platforms, and how these revealing are attacked by silencing regimes and organizations, most probably understand how urgent it is to act. And there are surely more who have heard the famous quote, "The only thing required for evil to triumph is that good people do nothing at all."